So this is our Ruyer reading group, continuing our reading of Cybernetics and the Origin of Information. So we're picking up from page 155 of the translation. So we're still on the supplementary chapter added to the second edition in 1967. After the first edition, I think, was 1958. And so he's in this part that we've been reading the last couple of weeks. He's been talking a lot about I guess effectively what we would call today machine learning. So designing computer systems not with like a sort of pre-built mode of operation that solves a certain problem or performs a certain task, but setting it up in such a way that it can acquire the ability to perform that task. And of course, this is like the way pretty much all of the AI tools that are around today work. That like you don't sort of build ChatGPT by giving it billions of rules for how to form sentences and put them together. Instead, it was just sort of given texts to analyze and trained on those texts, and based on that training, it taught itself, with obviously, rules and reinforcement and so on. But it kind of taught itself how to create text. And one of the very important features of this kind of system is that they are kind of a black box in the sense that no person working on ChatGPT or any of these other systems can sort of explain exactly what it's doing when it generates a certain text. There's like within the system, there's like billions of parameters, different values of numbers that are weights of the nodes in this network. And obviously, no person can sort of survey this set of billions of parameters and sort of grasp what it's doing. So a lot of the functioning of these systems is kind of mysterious, even to the people who are working on it. So he talks about a little bit earlier. He talked about like the problem of identifying a letter. Like you have a picture that contains writing, and you want to be able to identify what letters are in this picture. Of course, today this is something that is pretty easy for computers to do, but that was the result of many decades of work, off and on, not sort of steady throughout that whole period. But it's only in the last like 15 years or so that this has become like sort of a widespread technology that is very effective. And this kind of problem. So like the problem is not just identifying a letter, but it's also this letter can be written in different fonts, different handwriting. If it's a handwritten piece of writing, different orientations, sizes, colors, etc. So if you want to sort of identify like what are the features that make a letter J, for example, if you were to like sort of sit down and try to think through the problem and like capture the essence of the letter J just by some sort of like geometrical properties or whatever, it would be very difficult and you'd be very unlikely to be successful, I think. And like this kind of problem, of course, a child learning to read is able to solve this problem, just basically by being shown a bunch of different examples of the letter J, in different fonts and orientations and so on. And within a couple of years of being taught how to read, the child is capable of recognizing the letter J pretty reliably, and so the machine learning process sort of emulates that in the sense that the system is not given like a set of rules saying that if the shape has this property, then it's a letter J. Instead, it's just given many examples of the letter J. Hopefully with like enough variation in fonts and orientations so that it is not just learning one specific type of letter J, but sort of capturing all the different features that are required. And as a result of this, it is sort of set up in such a way that it can recognize a letter J. But again, the person, the experts who are designing this system don't necessarily know what it is that the system is using to recognize a letter J, what sort of features of a picture the system is sort of keying on to, identify that there's a letter J present in the picture. And this can also, depending on how you sort of, what sort of training data you use, this can lead to some undesired consequences. There's like a sort of famous example, I think it was trying to train a system to recognize pictures, to distinguish pictures of dogs and wolves. I think it was huskies particularly, so they're sort of wolf-like in their shape and coloring and so on and so on. And so you feed it a bunch of pictures of huskies and a bunch of pictures of wolves, and you label some of the pictures are labeled as huskies, the other ones are labeled as wolves, and then you test it on a new set of pictures that it hasn't seen, and you want to see can it distinguish the huskies from the wolves. And it turned out that the system, the training data, had the pictures of wolves were always or most often with a snowy background. So the system had actually just learned like a dog or a sort of dog-like, a canid animal with a snowy background equals a wolf. And so, so in this case, the training set was not broad enough to sort of force the system to recognize what you wanted it to recognize. This is just sort of like an example of how the functioning of these systems is a bit of a black box, in the sense that you sort of just feed it in the information and you hope it will, be able to make the distinctions that you are looking for. But if you give it, an insufficiently broad sort of training set, it ends up learning something that you didn't intend for it to learn. And I think the last couple of sessions we've been going through these examples that he's been describing. Some of them have turned out to be less convincing than some of the earlier parts of the book, like the parts from the 1958 edition. So he talks about translation, for example, and he's very skeptical about the possibility that you would ever be able to get a sort of artificial translation machine. And of course, this is something that we're all familiar with today. That DeepL or Google Translate, these things are actually pretty good. You can take a text in for the languages that there's a lot of available text for, English, French, German, I don't know, Japanese or something. I think Japanese maybe is not quite as good either. But anyway, text that there's a lot of training data that they can use. Just translating between these languages, it's probably about as good as a human translator who doesn't have any specific knowledge of the subject matter. Where there are mistakes, it's often mistakes that you can identify because sort of the context and the background information about what the meaning of the original text was. But if you didn't have that background knowledge, you wouldn't be able to say that this was a mistake. So the level of performance of a lot of these translation tools is much better than I think Ruyer would have thought possible, when he's writing in 1967. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't think that necessarily, invalidates all of his points. Maybe he was not quite as careful as he should have been. I think there's sort of two different elements of the criticisms he's making here. One is sort of an empirical prediction about what machines will be able to do, and that part hasn't held up that well. But I think the better, or the other portion of his argument that has held up better is a more sort of in principle argument about the fact that these automatic tools, these sort of machine tools, are always framed by a human decision. So even in the case of something like ChatGPT, which is has a sort of very open-ended set of capabilities to generate text and so on, it's still designed by people to do certain things. It turned out to be able to do certain things in a surprising way. I think the coding tool, the coding sort of capabilities were not really designed for when they made ChatGPT. They didn't sort of set out to give it the ability to write Python or whatever, and it sort of developed that almost by accident. But still, the sort of general project of developing ChatGPT was a human project, and of course you had to buy millions of GPUs and pay for electricity and scrape all the training data off the internet, etc. All these things were human decisions that were part of this broader project of developing this system, and so all these human decisions sort of frame the functioning of this automated system that is ChatGPT, and this framing rule of a human decision is something that in principle, like for Ruyer, in principle, you can't get rid of that sort of framing aspect and just sort of have machines operating like all the way down or operating autonomously in the sense of not requiring that framing decision. And I think that argument is something that is not entirely dependent on the like empirical predictions about how good translation tools will be 50 years from now or something like that. Okay, so yeah, we can pick up from page 155. I guess I know you're having some connection issues, but hopefully you can read that bit.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, mentality and the assimilation. Louis Coffignon has drawn a parallel between the, quote, function of mentality, unquote, and the biological function of the assimilation of chemical energy extracted from food. Quote, we can say that the organs, the digestive tract, the respiratory and circulatory systems have energy for their raw material, which they extract from data constituted by air and food that they supply to the other organs, which in turn give chemical energy in the form suitable to each cell. I think this block quote is from Coffignon. A critical remark here. Francois Moussard has pointed out that it is necessary to correct the language commonly used. It is not the energy of food that we consume, but only the usable energy, or negentropy. Not only do we not consume energy, but we must say that energy doesn't play any role. It doesn't have any value by itself. It is not consumed, which would be incompatible with the principle of the conservation of energy. We find it quantitatively intact after having used it. What was consumed, destroyed, or annihilated after the assimilation is negentropy, that is, the order or the non-disorder of energy. Now, Coffignon continues, it is another quote-unquote raw material that the organism receives from the environment, just like energy, information. All the informational operations, transmission, conservation, and combination of information can be carried out by humans. This conception can be criticized. Indeed, recall that information is itself constituted of 1, a support, and 2, a semantics, a collection of meanings, which is its essential element. The psychological meaning is not always a simple aspect of the support, as demonstrated by the difficulties of automatic translation. It has a certain autonomy. The support is essentially the language, transmissible as a series of signals, in general by the modulation of a carrier wave. Yet as Shannon and Miller have demonstrated, supports of information do indeed represent negentropy, or quote-unquote ordered energy. At the level of supports, the function of mentality is then quite similar to the biological function of the assimilation of food. A modulated carrier wave, received by the ear and quote-unquote assimilated by the auditory zone, is quite similar to meat or sugar whose structured chemical energy is assimilated. But what about the level of meaning, of which the elements, once again, are not always in one-to-one correspondence with the structures of the support? The cyberneticians have not attached sufficient importance to a paradox signaled by Shafroth and commented on by Costa de Beauregard, to which we have drawn attention in our own way, chapter 6 of this book. Suppose that the support of information is a set of forms in the physical sense, which can be taken in with a single glance, playing cards spread out, books on a library shelf, letters on the keyboard of a typewriter, and so on. As soon as the structure of the set is perceived, that is, insofar as it takes visual consciousness for us to support, and no longer the electromagnetic field or the photograph or the television screen, it no longer matters whether the elements of set are in objective order or disorder and represent more or less negentropy. Even if the cards in books are arranged haphazardly, quote-unquote, I can recognize a particular card or book without step-by-step optical scanning and without the use of pens, perforations, or magnetic indicators. The psychological information of the visual field is independent of the order or disorder of the objects represented in this field. I can see my inkwell on the table, wherever it is. The semantic assimilation of information, unlike the assimilation of food, is at least partly independent of negentropy and support. I know where the ace of clubs is, or the English dictionary, or the letter N on the keyboard, even if the elements of the set to which they belong are poorly or haphazardly arranged, whereas my organism does not thrive if it has to assimilate only quote-unquote disordered protein as food. Yeah, so maybe it's the economy with which he presents this argument here. It makes more sense now than it did in we need to consume, we need to consume structured, we can't consume sort of pure unstructured energy for food energy. We need to, our metabolism to continue function. But even when it comes to thought, perceptive consciousness, I don't have to always perceive something that is negentropic. I mean, I always perceive some kind of structure, but the sort of signal of the visual structure doesn't have to be of something good that is sort of unique. So, like, I can perceive a table that is in complete disarray, and I can still make sense of it, even though the material support has a relatively low level of negentropy. So he's pointing out that the negentropy of the support can't be the sole explanation for the meaning of the perception or the form of the perception because I can have an ordered thought about a disordered table. For instance, I can say this table is disordered, and that is a coherent synthetic judgment.
Yeah, sorry, there was a little bit of connection sort of distortion going on, but I think I got what you were saying. So I think, you're right. He sort of compresses the argument here. I think he's pointing back to some of the earlier discussion. I think it's chapter 6 is what he points to. So like the playing card example, like if you just sort of shuffle a deck, or you pick up a deck at random that has already been shuffled, you can sort of take the deck of cards and sort it by the number, like the face value or whatever. Like you can take something that is not ordered and add, or that doesn't have a certain kind of order that you are looking for, and make it ordered. You can order it, and so in this case you're taking something with high entropy and reducing the entropy. You're sort of making use of the obviously this process relies on the fact that your body has assimilated the negentropy from food, and so you can use this sort of order in the chemical bonds in the food. You can break it down, release the energy to move your muscles in your hands and arms, etc. But this sort of chemical process of breaking down bonds to release energy, of course, doesn't explain how you that you would have a very similar set of movements of your hands if you were to take an ordered deck and disorder it, like move the cards around to take them out of the order. So the operation of taking a disordered deck and ordering it versus taking an ordered deck and disordering it, in terms of like the physical processes of destruction of chemical bonds and so on, are very similar. But in terms of like the information operations going on, they're of course opposite. These are sort of the opposite operations of each other. So what this is sort of showing here is that the sort of information processing operations, in this case, taking a deck of cards and ordering the cards, can't be explained purely in terms of this sort of assimilation of negentropy. And I think it's this. I mean, this is almost sort of the core of the book, is the fact that humans are capable of producing information, of taking something disordered and making it ordered. And so this sort of introduction of new order is sort of like the core, I think, problem that he's interested in this book. And one, like the cybernetic approach in general, sort of is wants to explain away this sort of appearance of new order as a sort of epiphenomenon of the degradation of existing order. That it's always a question of assimilating existing order, breaking it down and processing it in certain ways to create a new order, or what seems to be a new order. But that sort of new order is actually just the result of breaking down an existing order. And Ruyer is arguing against that, and he's insisting that there actually is a creation of a new order, even though that creation of a new order can only come about by means of this degradation of existing order. Like in the case of the card sorting task, you can only do that because you have these chemical bonds that you can break down to release energy to move your muscles and so on. So of course there's no sort of pure creation of order in the sense that it would just sort of out of nothing, it would just create order out of nothing. The creation of order is always accompanied by some sort of breakdown of existing order to effectuate itself to actually make some sort of change happen in the world. But that doesn't mean that the creation of order is not real or is not something that's actually happening. Like the deck of cards really does end up being ordered by face value or whatever. And I mean, this is a pretty trivial example, but like you can think of more interesting examples. Someone writing a novel or coming up with a scientific theory or whatever it is. Of course, this process involves the creation of some very intricate and complicated order. And you can't write a novel without eating at some point in that process, and taking in food that has these chemical bonds that you can extract energy from, etc. But that doesn't mean that like the food explains the novel. That like novel writing is just a product of breaking down chemical bonds in your food. And so I think that's sort of what he's insisting on here, is that there's more to this process of the creation of new order than just the breakdown of existing order, even if the breakdown of existing order is necessary for that creation of new order to happen. We seem to have lost Angus again, but yeah, I'll just keep going with the next section, and hopefully he'll be able to rejoin. Okay, patterns. The practiced typist improvises some schemas of taping in coordinated quote-unquote sets on her keyboard, where the letters are not in alphabetical order. Even if she types what is dictated to her, she needs to transform this auditory information into spatial motor schemas without visually scanning the keyboard. However, she can also compose directly on her keyboard, and in this case, she improvises the schemas of the words in her sentences before the motor schemas of the letters for typing each word. As linguists long have, the cyberneticians Gray Walter and Couffignal have perceived the importance of spatial or temporal schemas, chains and sequences of chains, as means of access to the analysis of the semantic part of information. The English word pattern is often used to designate these schemas. It comes from the French word patron, and it has roughly the meaning of, quote, template for a dressmaker, unquote, standard form for the cut of a dress. Unfortunately for the anti-Prangler purists, the word patron would too often be equivocal. The pattern is, quote-unquote, anti-chance. A child hits the keys of a keyboard haphazardly, while the typist hits according to the motor patron of the words. Even if the child runs his finger over the line of letters in the order on the keyboard, he produces nothing meaningful, despite this physical order. To produce some pattern, and therefore meaning, it is necessary to break this order. The psychological effect produced by a physical action is generally perceived according to patterns, sometimes arbitrarily, such as when we introduce a rhythm into a regular succession of sounds, or some imaginary figures into a randomly distributed set of points. The pattern is individualized in consciousness. It is stored in memory. It can be transposed to different materials, like a patron for a dress, and it can be recognized in a confused set. It can be decoded, designated, imitated, and completely modified. A billiards player does not mistake the ball, despite the two white ones being indistinguishable physically, because he makes or sees the pattern of the shot that he or his adversary is taking. The meaningful pattern can be superimposed on the sensory pattern, become so intimately united with it that it is artificial to separate the two patterns, as perceptual illusions demonstrate. But it is still the meaning that is active and that activates the uniquely resulting pattern. This is particularly evident, for example, when we perceive meaningful figures in a Rorschach test plate or in a pseudo artwork such as a poem, a piece of music, or a painting randomly generated by machinery. We believe ourselves to be reading or hearing passively, even though we are in fact active. So this, I guess, is this section. He's just sort of insisting on the sort of activity that is involved in detecting a pattern. So even something or well, in creating and in detecting a pattern. So in the case of the typist, for example, I mean, this is something that's actually pretty interesting. Is that like if you sit at a keyboard, I mean, most of us who are sort of more or less moderately good typists can type without like actually looking at the keyboard and sort of hunting for each letter as we go along. Like it's pretty painful to watch someone who is actually doing that. Is sort of like looking for, oh, where's the Q, etc. But if someone were to like sit me down with a blank piece of paper and say like draw a keyboard, like where each letter is, I would get like the QWERTY row at the beginning, and then I'd probably be lost after that. So at some level, I know where the letters are because I can find them by typing without looking at the keyboard. But that knowledge is kind of like locked into those motor schemas, I guess. It's very difficult for me to sort of access that knowledge and use it to draw the keyboard on a page with like the locations of the letters. And you can think of like lots of other kind of motor activities. Like if you were to explain to someone how you ride a bike, like what sort of movements you have to make to ride a bike, it would be pretty difficult, I think, to describe. Of course, there's a lot of like sort of fine balancing action that you do when you're riding a bike that is like almost impossible to explain exactly what you're doing. So there's a lot of knowledge that is sort of embedded in our movements that is hard for us to sort of extract explicitly, to like sort of put it into words or conceptualize it or sort of make it the object of our attention that we can sort of communicate to others and so on. But that doesn't mean that the knowledge is not sort of there in some sense, or that structure is not there in some sense. And what he's pointing to here is, so in the case of these patterns, this is kind of like something extracted from the physical situation that in some circumstances can be communicated to a different situation. The case of the bike riding movements, it's very difficult for us to sort of capture the pattern of those movements and sort of move it to a different situation. But in other cases, you can, like, this is sort of the whole project of like scientific management with Taylor and so on. It was like you would study the movements of workers in some sort of industrial process, break them down into these very simple component movements. Pick up this object, swing the hammer 30 degrees upwards, etc. Like these very simple movements, with the purpose of being able to extract these sort of embodied skills, this sort of embedded knowledge that is sort of incorporated in the motor schemas of the workers, to extract this and be able to convey it to other workers who, of course, would be paid less and have less capacity to control the work process. So this project of sort of extracting the patterns from these movements is often quite difficult, but it doesn't mean that it's impossible. You can, and even in like a very simple, like he talks about some of these examples where we're sort of like generating the pattern by interpreting it. So you can think of like looking at clouds, for example, and you see, oh, that looks sort of like a horse or whatever. You're sort of like, obviously the cloud is not like a picture of a horse. It wasn't made to look like a horse. But you have this sort of horse schema. You've seen horses or pictures of horses, and then you are sort of imposing that schema onto this more or less amorphous mass of cloud, and like generating a pattern out of it. And this is a kind of secondary use, of course, of these like pattern recognition processes that our visual systems did not evolve to see horses in clouds. But at the same time, all of our everyday actions of seeing fruit within a tree, within the branches of a tree, for example, which is much more sort of evolutionarily relevant. It's a similar kind of process. We're still like identifying patterns, picking out the schema, the elements of the situation that align with a certain schema. So yeah, the seeing the horse in the clouds is kind of just a secondary phenomenon of the same kind of capacity as identifying the fruit within the branches of the tree. So all of our perception, even the more sort of trivial everyday perception of the objects that we are interested in finding, it involves this kind of active pattern production rather than just a kind of like passive reception of information.
Yeah, so I've been going back as I read some Maimon scholarship. I've been going back to some Kant and Kant scholarship, and I thought that the discussion of the schematism here as kind of irreducible to the material support found interesting in light of the prominence of the schematism for Kant's epistemology, and it seems like part of what part of the part of what is not or difficult to reduce to mechanization in these schemas or patterns for Ruyer is the capacity for improvisation. And so, certain kind of hand gestures of workers on a factory floor may be able to be instantiated in the functioning of factory machines. But I think we've talked before about in this group about how difficult it is to get a mechanical hand or a robot to sort of recognize the right thing and pick it up in a way that would be very simple for a human being. I wonder if that fluidity and capacity for improvisation with the schematism is something that Ruyer would say is at least very difficult to get a machine to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the schematism bit in the first critique is one of the more obscure parts, and he only dedicates like 3 pages to it, which doesn't help. Yeah, so I think so. One of the examples that he gives of like a schema is our capacity to recognize a dog, for example. That like so. Within the sort of empiricist tradition, there was like this criticism, especially Berkeley was associated with this criticism of like general concepts. Like Berkeley says, I can't sort of picture a man without picturing him as tall or short or dark hair or light hair, etc. Like there's no such thing as like a picture of a general man that doesn't have some sort of determinate height and hair color and all these things. And I mean, this is true. Like you can't sort of picture a man like a general man. But of course, we do have the capacity to, reliably identify, this is a man or a dog. Like most people are not going to be confused by, I'm not sure if this is a man or a dog or whatever. And this, so of course, we are capable of recognizing this is a man, whether that man is short or tall. And this is the same kind of problem as, recognizing the letter J, whether it's, written by hand or, in different fonts, etc. And what's kind of interesting about this sort of schema argument, so Kant wants this like concept of the schema that involves some kind of activity and role for like this active role for the imagination, and it has some sort of temporal component, though it's not too clear exactly what that is supposed to be doing here. So the idea, I think, is that like our capacity to recognize a dog is not something like a picture of a general dog, which of course doesn't make any sense, but it's something like a capacity to produce like a performance. It's a kind of activity of like dog sketching or something like that, that like by recognizing something as a dog, we're sort of like sketching the dogness of this perceived object. But what's kind of interesting about the machine learning processes is that it kind of is producing an abstract dog picture. You just sort of feed in 1 million pictures of dogs and 1 million pictures of not dogs, and you label them dog or not dog, and then this sort of obscure, extraction of like pixel features from these photos results in the capacity for this system to identify in new pictures that it hasn't seen, is there a dog in this picture or not? And of course there are these funny examples where you have like the dog curled up, or is it a cinnamon bun or whatever, that sometimes the systems are confused by these kinds of pictures, although so are humans. But like in general, you can like identifying is there a dog in this picture is something that is not too difficult for these computer vision systems now, and so they are sort of producing a general like abstract dog image, even though it doesn't look anything like an image that a person would like be able to look at. And these systems are not really doing anything like a schematization. They're not sort of actively sketching dogness. But I think maybe like more generally, this capacity for improvisation or flexibility, I think maybe is the more general term in the sense that is maybe what distinguishes even these like abstract dog picture generation processes from like more human learning processes. So, I mean, of course, if you're like training a person, say, you hire a new worker in your factory and you say, here's how you do this operation. You're not just going to give them like a million pictures of or like a million video clips of someone performing the operation correctly and a million video clips of someone not performing the operation correctly, and then like ask them to, learn, like just take them to sort of passively learn the correct performance of this operation by watching these video clips. You sort of, like we talked about this before, that like a lot of the learning processes that we do, like education processes, involve sort of like a gradual expansion of the degree of flexibility and responsibility that the person is assigned. So like when you're teaching, it's like maybe you bring in the worker in the factory, they're just like brand new, they don't know anything about this process. You would give them like the easiest, sort of simplest task, the one that is like the closest to what they would have familiarity with from outside the factory, and the one that they are least likely to break something important or cause damage, etc. And then when they've mastered that, you sort of give them something a bit more complicated, that requires more care, more responsibility, more understanding of the situation, etc. And then you sort of build up from there. And so part of what it is to become like an expert or like an effective worker in this task is not just the reliably performing this set of movements on command, but like being able to adapt in a flexible way. Like what if the machine is going a little bit slower, a little bit faster than usual, or this material is like harder or softer than usual, etc. Like you can sort of adapt to the situation in a way that allows you to still succeed despite like circumstances being different than what you expect. And there's a kind of continuity between this, like, I mean, the factory worker who can sort of adapt to a slightly different material is not exhibiting a huge amount of creativity, but there's a kind of continuity between that and like this sort of pattern generation / recognition process. You can think of like artists who they see a block of marble and they can like kind of see the statue in the block of marble already, that like the rest of us just see a block of marble. It just looks like a amorphous mass of stone, but they can already see like, okay, I just chip away this bit and smooth out this bit, etc. And then there's a person, a body of a person in this block of marble. Of course, this is so from their perspective, they might sort of just view this as a kind of passive process. They're just sort of like recognizing what's in the marble. But at the same time, like that capacity to recognize the potential person in the block of marble is a kind of active process, in the sense that you have to learn how to, like, these artists are not just sort of born with the capacity to recognize the shape of a human body in a block of marble. They like acquire this by studying statues that other people have made, by working, like in sort of the Renaissance tradition, you would work in the workshop of a master and like do the easy bits until you have mastered that, and then start working on the more intricate parts, etc. So yeah, this capacity to perceive order, even in where it doesn't exist yet, is something that is acquired through activity and production of order. That like, yeah, it's only by working as an apprentice sculptor who like does many, probably hundreds of like simple like rough sketches of like a human body that then the master like fills in, that you sort of acquire that capacity to just sort of see the pattern that isn't there yet, and then realize it. So there's this sort of strong connection between activity and generation of order that I think, aligns with what Kant is talking about with the schematism, even if some of these examples of, recognizing the dog versus not dog photos kind of avoid the need for the kind of schematism that he was pointing to in the first critique.
Yeah, that's a good point. And obviously, ChatGPT is capable of improvising, and I can. Its response may not be very, all that interesting or clever, but if I asked ChatGPT to give me a fictional dialogue between Raymond Ruyer and Leibniz, it could produce something that is sort of recognizably related to those thinkers. So it can deploy these, I guess, kind of its Ruyer schema and its Leibniz schema in unforeseeable, in response to unforeseeable prompts. Obviously, it hasn't been specifically programmed to be able to construct that kind of dialogue. It kind of raises a difficult question for me, I guess. What if the schematism is not kind of a hard line delineating human capacity for thought from LLMs, then of what exactly that line would be is sort of a difficult call for me. Maybe the ability to kind of deploy schematism in logically valid judgment, or you mentioned the case of the artist sort of being able to see within the block of marble the future statue, and maybe a difference that Ruyer might, or that might be sort of compatible with Ruyer's argument in this book, would be that the Renaissance artisan or apprentice starts out maybe somewhat talented in order to get selected for the apprenticeship at all, but still far away from Annibale Carracci or whoever in terms of the level of talent. But ultimately, the human apprentice artist can produce works of art that aren't the average as lots of other works that they've encountered. There's a sort of, I guess, a genuine creation of information in, I don't know, Raphael's ability to synthesize classical geometric form and kind of Christian religious motifs that it's at least now difficult to see an LLM or a similar sort of machine learning, AI being able to produce a genuinely original and sort of information bearing synthesis. I mean, a genuine creation of information, just more or less lossy compression of existing information.
Yeah, it's very difficult to, I think. I mean, partly it's just the nature of the concept of creativity or invention is that if you can sort of define creativity or invention, if you can sort of say invention is X, then you're kind of delimiting the bounds of what that creativity or invention is, and part of what we mean by creativity or invention is precisely that it's something that exceeds some pre-given set of bounds or delimitation. So it's hard to give a criterion to say a process is creative if it has property X, Y, Z, because then you're sort of saying X, Y, Z is kind of the limits of creativity, and then then you're kind of losing what if someone comes up with a new sort of process that has different properties, is that creative or not? It's hard to say. And I think if we stick with artworks, for example, the sort of what we recognize, I think retrospectively as the sort of the most creative or the most important creative works are not necessarily the ones that were sort of recognized in their time as being the most sort of perfected examples of art. Often the sort of stereotypical examples are people like Van Gogh, who were sort of commercial failures at the time, that they had very little sort of public recognition. But then sort of retroactively or retrospectively, we see them as kind of inventing a new way of painting rather than just creating new paintings in an existing sort of understanding of what painting is. And so like if you so like ChatGPT or DALL-E or these types of systems are basically just sort of taking existing artistic works and, like as you said, sort of like lossy compression of like all the art of this sort of category, and then creating like a sort of generic version of like this is a sort of typical instance of this kind of artwork. And if that's all they're doing, then they can't really you can't really expect that sort of process to result in like a new way of creating art, a new sort of form of art. It can so just at best sort of produce a good representative of this style of art that already exists. But yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, the fact that Van Gogh, of course, was completely unrecognized in his lifetime, that no one or very few people, Gauguin I think may be one of the exceptions, but like very few people looked at his paintings and said, wow, this is like a new sort of era of art that is beginning with this artwork. It was just a lot of people just didn't really get what was going on. It just didn't really make any sense to them. And so it's not necessarily something that you can like sort of point to in an artwork and say this artwork has the property X, therefore it's creative or innovative or inventive or whatever. This is very difficult, and it's also almost even like a kind of retroactive, like making it inventive in the sense that an artwork that inspires other artists to explore some aspect of painting or music or whatever it is that had not been explored before can sort of retroactively become like an invention by virtue of the fact that other artists sort of picked up what that first artist was doing. And then maybe if that had not happened, then I mean these artworks would probably just like sit in the warehouse of a gallery or something and no one would ever look at them. So it's not necessarily some like intrinsic quality of this artwork that makes it inventive, but also how other people take it up and extend what it was doing, or maybe react violently against it. That happens sometimes as well. It's much more complicated, I think, than just saying like humans are capable of doing X and that's creative, but machines are not capable of doing X, so they aren't creative. But yeah, it's very difficult to sort of pin down any sort of property of human creativity that is like in principle not reproducible by a machine. I think like this has been a sort of recurring phenomenon where you have someone says, oh, computers will never be able to do X, and then like 10, 20, whatever years later, you have computers that are at least doing something resembling X pretty effectively. Obviously in this book we saw like the translation example that Ruyer seemed pretty confident that computers would not ever be able to like produce good translations or competent translations, which of course now they are. So yeah, this kind of prediction that like computers will never be able to do X. Like if you were to say creativity consists of X, computers will never be able to do X, therefore computers will never be creative. I think that that kind of prediction, or like this pattern of thought that relies on this empirical prediction about what computers will be able to do, I think is pretty unlikely to be or is a pretty unreliable inference that like there's a good chance that you will be wrong about that prediction. But I think part of what we mean by creativity is precisely that it's not limited to this whatever this capacity to do X is. Like you can't sort of pin down this ability is what we mean by creativity. It has like it's precisely this like capacity to go beyond any sort of pinned down ability, to sort of take the existing set of abilities that a person has and give them a new configuration, etc. And so that makes it very difficult to I guess identify like a certain capacity that humans have for creativity that a machine that would distinguish humans from machines kind of in principle.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it makes me think of Berg's the famous distinction between the virtual and the possible, and maybe the the kind of art that is produced by machine learning tends to be kind of, I guess, restricted to the realm of the possible, I guess. Whereas with like Van Gogh or even like Duchamp or any of the major formal innovations in various media, beginning of the 20th century or into the 19th, whatever period, are sort of not possible until they've happened. And yeah, maybe that is related to this inability to articulate in advance what a principle of creativity would be. Just sort of the modality of creativity is such that it can't be given a rule in advance.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think maybe, I mean, it probably takes us too far away from the text, but I think it's also interesting that like creativity as a value of artistic creation is also not a kind of universal, like it's not all times and places that have taken creativity to be like a sort of central element of what artistic production is about. Like you think of like the medieval, medieval European sort of icon paintings and sort of church paintings and so on. Like many of these, or probably most of these paintings, the actual name of the person who painted them is not known. They're like attributed to like the master of this town or whatever. Like you can sort of trace that like these groups of paintings were from the same workshop, but the person is not known. And in many cases, like you can sort of like from our perspective, the perspective of sort of art history post 19th century, you can sort of recognize this workshop was innovative. It was producing artworks in it was like sort of transforming the given expected style and conventions of this form and doing something different with them. But that was not necessarily something that those people who were working in that workshop probably were like aiming for, or that their clients were sort of like demanding that, oh, we want to have something innovative. So like in many cases, and again, like that Renaissance workshop model, it was like, here's this master who has, he's a skilled craftsman who like has this knowledge, the skill of this form of production, and the apprentice will sort of acquire that skill and then be able to produce new works. But it wasn't necessarily understood as like what we would say as innovation and this sort of artistic genius sort of model. It was more like, yeah, being a skilled craftsman involves a certain amount of independence and capacity to create new works on your own, but not necessarily in the sense of like transformative and changing the conventions of what it is to paint or what it is to sculpt, etc. So yeah, it might, I don't know what exactly that will tell us about machines, but the focus and the emphasis on creativity and innovation that we have today are not necessarily universal when it comes to what it is that makes someone an artist or skilled in any domain. Like it's not necessarily, we don't always in all domains and across all times and places take the capacity to innovate as like what exemplifies someone as being skilled in that domain.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I also don't want to totally derail the discussion, but I think, yeah, in cases like, the anonymous master of Christ in the wine press or whatever, 13th century, like Northern European painting or similar artisanal traditions, I think it was not really that important. It was, maybe closer to like artistic or decorative art than the kind of contemporary cult of innovation, which sometimes can obviously overvalue innovation as such. But even in like Greek tragedy, for instance, there are and are recognizable at the time like stylistic differences and differing formal decisions between like Aeschylus and Sophocles. In Aeschylus, everyone wore masks, and some of the other tragedians, not all of them did. And yeah, but I agree, that's a difficult art historical question. The extent to which of originality and innovation makes sense as applied to movements in art before the 19th century.
Yeah, I mean, we're running out of time, but yeah, this is like a whole. We could probably have a whole like series on just on this question. But yeah, and like a lot of these, yeah, like these sort of medieval masters, the sort of anonymous masters. Like I think a lot of what they would have understood themselves as doing is sort of like continuing a tradition, like keeping a tradition alive, and maybe part of the sort of the fact that they or this sort of non-emphasis on creativity and innovation is partly to do with the fact that there was no sort of mechanical perpetuation of a tradition in the way that there is now, that like we today can sort of like I don't know, look at photographs of these church paintings, and sort of like keep them alive in the sense that we like can just sort of mechanically reproduce images of those paintings. And you can think of like the printing press, of course, like changes the way book production happens. But if you actually have to like actively reproduce, you have to recopy these books over time, or else they just like degrade and disappear. That sort of changes the way you understand the sort of production of books and the maintenance of this book in existence. Like, of course, many like medieval and earlier times, like one of the most popular genres of books was like the compilation, where like you would just sort of take like the nice quotes from a bunch of different authors on this topic, because like copying all 12 volumes of whatever was like very labor intensive, and so you just take the best parts that you actually care about, and of course in a world where you can reproduce 1,000 or 1,000,000 copies of this book with a machine, that sort of selection of key passages is maybe less important. And yeah, the epic philosophy quotes Twitter thread. I mean, that's what Diogenes Laertius is pretty much, right? um, uh, but yeah, so like the fact that you have to actively keep this tradition of art or literature or whatever it is alive by producing something new that sort of manifests that tradition, maybe makes that sort of self-generating tradition more like puts that in focus, as opposed to like demarcating your creation from what came before, which maybe is more the focus now. But yeah, it's very, very interesting, but also very far beyond the scope of this book, I think, question. Yeah, so I think we should stop here because I need to get going. But we can pick up on this next time. And yeah, I think the art examples are good ones to keep in mind when we're reading this, because this is sort of like one of the like hot sort of domains of AI stuff today. Generating images, generating music, etc., and what that means for human artists. So this is one area that I think is like especially relevant to think about in relation to this text from what was it 60 whatever years ago. Okay, so yeah, thanks for coming out, everyone. Thanks for your contributions. I think next week we should be able to do the full length, but yeah, we can yeah pick up from here next week.
That sounds good. Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone.